thought it's only right that we pay tribute to Sir Michael Parkinson, because he was a broadcast maverick, and he changed the game and the landscape of broadcasting for many generations. And we're joined now by Brian from Eastry, who was a friend of Sir Michael Parkinson. Brian, my condolences to you, and very sad to hear the passing of Sir Michael Parkinson. May I begin by asking, what did he mean to you?
You've really summed up his career pretty well just now. It's good to hear from you all. Yes, I met Michael more than 50 years ago. We did a television chat show together from Cardiff. I think it was on BBC Wales, if I remember rightly. And there were half a dozen or so. But he and I got on particularly well. And as we were leaving, he said, look, I don't really want to go and stay in the hotel they booked. Can I, drop on the couch? And I said, well, you come to our guest room. Be a pleasure. And indeed, to this day, whenever Michael turns up on the television, the children always like to say, the first time we ever saw Michael Parkinson was in his underpants shaving the next morning. But yes, we became very great friends. We had mutual friends like Peter Ustinov. And eventually, when Jan and I got married in 1971, we spent our honeymoon. Michael said, well, we actually travelled up to London one day on the train, and he said, when are you two buggers going to get married? and I said, no, I've been trying to work out how to do it. I said, I thought it would be nice to get married in Paris, but the bureaucracy is so cumbersome. And I was wondering all sorts of... Then, of course, there's always Gretna Green. And he said, why, if you do get married, he said, apparently you should bloody well get married. Come and have your honeymoon with us in Windsor. So we did. We got married in London. We had our wedding party in London, and we spent our honeymoon with Michael and Mary, and we went out picnicking in Hyde Park, I remember very well. It was quite a joyous occasion. But you see, the thing about Michael is this. I've always been aware in broadcasting and in writing how often it is that one's great chums disappear. I mean, Alan Corran, brilliant writer, wonderful humorist, superb broadcaster, a great friend of mine for many years. And when Alan died, his reputation died with him. But people will still read his books and say they're good, but they almost disappear. They become eclipsed when they die. James Robertson Justice, who was in all the movies that I liked when I was a kid. Jimmy Edwards on radio. Bob Monkhouse. Monkhouse was a terribly clever man. And what about Frank Muir? Extraordinary wordsmith. These are great names, and when they died, they disappeared from the firmament. But that won't happen to Michael, because he, as you rightly said, broke the mould in broadcasting. All the chat show hosts before then had been well-spoken people like Chris Stewart, I remember, often appeared on his show. You had David Frost, you had John Freeman. They all spoke the kind of English I do. They spoke proper, southern, normal BBC English. But Michael was a bluff northerner. His culture wasn't the same. His pronunciation wasn't the same. His language, his thought process. He was a direct, down-to-earth, no-nonsense journalist. And the way that he approached his interviews was totally no-nonsense. I'm taking no wounded prisoners. I'm going straight for it. And the people that he interviewed were just unbelievable. Every single major personality appeared on his program. And it's very hard now to turn on TV and see any sort of retrospective compilation program without there being an interview by Michael of somebody famous. He's almost a sort of Encyclopedia Britannica of everybody who was famous in the 70s and 80s. Extraordinary chap.
I don't think there's anyone else who can beat that. And Brian, it's interesting that you were talking there about the manner and the way certain presenters before Michael presented themselves, very southern. I suppose they probably had the RP tone, yep. And Michael certainly wasn't affiliated to that world. He certainly didn't have an RP tone, and he came and changed the game and was himself, and enabled people who were from different parts of the UK to have that opportunity to seek a career in broadcasting.
Yeah. Well, there were early examples. What was his name? Freddie Griswood, wasn't it? He had a regional accent. There were people with northern accents in the past. But what they used to do, they normally spoke RP, received pronunciation, the way I'm talking to you now. You know, normal, what they used to call Oxford English. But if you had them on the program, and I didn't know them, but producers that I knew told me this was the case, they would basically say, how northern do you want me? And they'd say, well, just a bit, or 20%, or the full whack. And they would do the accents as a novelty. And it was interesting that the whole idea was, we're getting away from normal BBC English, and here's some rather wacky character who's a bit of a yokel, and isn't it a laugh? Now, Michael wasn't like that. Michael was so totally mainstream, and he did exactly as you say. He reminded people that you did not have to come from the South and speak BBC English to be a successful BBC broadcaster. And I have to say that it was a pleasure and a privilege to know him, and he was just totally and utterly and ineradicably northern. He had a terrible chip on his shoulder. I mean, if you were in a group talking, you wouldn't get through 10 minutes before he'd say, it's all very well for you bloody southerners. I mean, up north. And it came out all the time. He was always like that. And his wife, Mary, you know, she was a good broadcaster too, and looked after him dearly and loved him dearly. She will be bereft at the fact that he died. But, I mean, he did get to 88. And I don't think any of us can complain about an innings that's as long as that.
What do you think he will be remembered for, his best or infectious trait?
I think it was simply the fact that he wore his heart on his sleeve. I mean, I've seen many chat show hosts who will try and, if they are embarrassed, Russell Harty was an example. If he had somebody who was running him the wrong way, he'd try and cover it up or muddle through it. But Michael, if he was embarrassed, he'd say, well, now you're embarrassing me now. And he'd say it exactly as it happened. There was nothing, my mother used to say there was no side to people. I don't quite know what that means between you and me, but I think the audience does. There was no hidden agenda with Michael Parkinson. What you saw was what you got. And the interesting thing was, I mean, I've done a lot of programs, a lot of lengthy interviews, and I always, you'll laugh when I tell you this, but if ever I did a big round-table discussion from BBC in London, I would have a square of paper in front of me, and on it I would write everybody's name and their position round the table, and against me I would put Brian J. Ford. And people would say, that's to remind you who you are. And I said, no, of course not. But in a way it almost was. I was always frightened I would forget somebody's name. But Michael, when he was going to do an interview, he had a team of researchers. There would be 4 or 5 youngsters who would research everything about the person, and he'd have all the notes typed onto yellow paper because, of course, yellow paper didn't reflect as badly on the TV lights. And he always had a big wad of research notes, and he knew more or less what the interviewer was going to ask. And he wouldn't do an interview unless he had lots and lots of research notes. Now, I never did that. I'd talk to people in the green room and chat to them, and I might sometimes realize they had an interesting little story to tell. But whenever I did an interview, I would always do it cold, and I thought it worked that way. But Michael was so much more professional. He liked to have full sheets of paper, 4 or 5 sheets with questions typed on and notes and background. And if he didn't have that, he wouldn't do the interview.
May he rest in peace. Brian, thank you so much for your time this morning. Summed him up, well, to a T. And as I've been saying all morning, I think what made Sir Michael Parkinson unique was that he was relatable, and what you saw is what you get. And I think Brian, more or less, and the wedding story there, I think that's gonna stick with me.